I'm Rudy El-Khoui, Dean of the School of Architecture. Happy to welcome you to our Tecnoglass lecture series. I'd like to thank our sponsors, as usual, Tecnoglass, whose support has enabled us to sustain a very ambitious programming for 5 years almost. We are very grateful. Also, I'd like to thank the AIA Miami for offering our community and lecture attendees 1.5 CEUs for each lecture, so don't forget to sign up for these if you are interested. So I'm delighted to present tonight's guest speaker, Juergen J.MAYER.H. Juergen leads a Berlin-based award-winning practice operating at the intersection of architecture, communication, and new technology, with projects ranging from urban plans, buildings, to installation work and product design. High-profile projects, to name just a few, include Metropol Parasol, the redevelopment of the Plaza de la Encarnación in Seville, the Court of Justice in Hasselt, and several public and infrastructural projects in Georgia. I like to think of him as the state architect of Georgia. And we talk about not Georgia in the US, but Georgia in Europe. For example, an airport in Mestia, the border checkpoint in Sapri, and rest stops along the state highway. And of course, in Miami, a section of the provocative museum garage in the design district that I'm sure you are familiar with. Juergen studied at the University of Stuttgart, the Cooper Union, and Princeton University. His work has been published and exhibited worldwide and is part of numerous collections, including MoMA New York, SF MoMA, Kunstbibliothek Berlin, as well as numerous other public and private collections. Prestigious international awards include the Mies van der Rohe Award, the Wholesome Europe Award, and Audi Urban Futures Award. Juergen also taught at Princeton University, the University of the Arts in Berlin, Harvard University, the Architecture Association, Columbia University, and University of Toronto. Please join me in welcoming Juergen J.MAYER.H.
Thanks so much, Rudolf, for the introduction and for the invitation. Thanks to the School of Architecture here in Miami, and of course, thanks to Tecnoglass for making all of this possible. And now I need somebody to help me how to move this slideshow forward. What, do I push the button? This one here? Okay. I found it. Yeah, it's exciting to be here, and I just actually explained to Rudy and the board that I just had this memory again that my first trip to the States was in 1988 or something, and it was by Greyhound for 8 weeks, going from New York all the way to Orlando, Miami, New Orleans, up to Chicago, across to Sacramento, and Salt Lake City, San Francisco, down to Grand Canyon, and Los Angeles. And when we came to Miami, and we mostly stayed in hostels, we had a list of all the buildings we wanted to see. And this was mostly Arquitectonica buildings in 88 or 87. And we put up this sign saying, "We are the guide, you are the driver." Like, who wants to drive us around? We were 4 students from the University of Stuttgart. And there was actually somebody the next morning saying, "I have this cheap convertible, jump in, I'll drive you around." And it turns out that he knew the buildings as well, and we had a fantastic day. And at the end of the day, he asked us, "Now I want you to write a letter to the mayor of Miami and telling him that I'm the one who is the right person to buy the Pan Am water airplane terminal and turn it into a hostel, into a hotel for young people." And we thought about it. I think we did in the end. We weren't sure if this was like something strange or good to do, but this was a very great introduction into Miami life. And of course, I've been many, many times showing at Art Basel, showing at Design Miami, and having friends here in the city. So it's fantastic to be back. Long intro short. I'm showing you work today from small scale to large scale, from artwork to urban interventions. And it all starts with kind of a personal obsession that comes from looking at surfaces as a starting point to create space. It goes from two-dimensional to three-dimensional to maybe even four-dimensional. We see surfaces or the interest in surfaces spans from how are they constructed, what is the back construction of surfaces, what is the information quality of surfaces, the haptic and sensorial aspects of it, what is behind and in front of a surface, and what is before and after on a surface. I want to start with this obsession that I mentioned before, and they are called data protection patterns. And I'm sure you all have seen them before. It's these patterns, a camouflage of information that mostly is found on multiple forms. The forms that you tear apart when you get a shipping slip, maybe your salary printout, a PIN number from your bank. It's something that camouflages personal information. And it's a company based in Berlin, or was based in Berlin, went bankrupt in '86, who was at the forefront of font and type development worldwide. It's called, the company was called Berthold, and this is their company building. And they produced LED stamps already at the end of the 19th century to create these kind of how you call it, this kind of mesh of numbers and letters to create confusion. And these patterns are now mostly found of the inside of envelopes, and this is because once you get a letter that has personal information and you hold it against the light, this pattern confuses your information or camouflages the private information. Similarly here on these multiple forms, when you get a printout or your personal PIN number, it's produced by printing through the pattern onto a second layer, but the pattern on the front page camouflages the print inside that envelope. And my research was not super successful, but the information I found was that around maybe the end of 19th century, with the advent of carbon paper, and those of you who still know typewriters, you could write the original and copies at the same time by having a carbon paper that kind of traces your writing onto the next page through the pressure of this carbon powder onto the other. I even feel like I have to explain now how carbon paper works. So it's an efficiency tool in administration. You could write the invoice and the shipping slip and all of this at the same time. And in areas where you don't want the information to show up, it had a pre-printed camouflage pattern. So if you type in the value of the product that's shipped, you wouldn't be able to read it because it's just part of that confusion of numbers and letters. So I'm very interested in this kind of strategic tool that divides between an inside and outside, a personal and, let's say, a public phase of communication. It works similarly to buildings, where the envelope of a building divides between an inside and outside, between discretion and exposure, between an address, a window that actually personalizes that building or anchors that building to a specific person or people. So here you see a shipping slip, and I have a collection maybe of about 300 different patterns, and I'm still collecting. So if you find patterns, there's so many out there. I'm happy to collect them and add them to my obsession. Here are some envelopes, interior patterns, and they come from numbers, letters, camouflage patterns, very geometric graphic designs. These are names of cities, for example, or even companies have their own graphic patterns. There's no real rule or norm how confusing or how dense or how loose they have to be. I think it's a trial and error process. So these are all found objects. It's very easy to collect them. We just sit at home and wait for them to come to your house. So by taking these patterns and enlarging them and actually occupying this layer of negotiation between these conditions I described before, I'm starting to kind of explore a space that has this ambivalence qualities of being either inside or outside, of being hidden part of a network, of a kind of a neutrality that can be still shaped and modulated towards a specific meaning, program, or a site. This is an exhibition design for Berlinische Gallery, which is the State Museum of Berlin, where we printed this pattern, enlarged them to a scale of a person, printed it on carpet, and enveloped that space with that carpet. And once it was established, the sound effect was different, but also people used the space in a completely different way. It was fun to actually look at the wall, very pedagogical for school classes also, to start reading numbers, making combinations, kind of a playful interaction between people who saw the space. On the other hand, there was also, and do I have a pointer here? I don't know. Maybe I can use this mouse. Is there one? Okay, thanks. Much more maybe important for the work that I'm showing you now are these 3D prints that sit on these pedestals. And these 3D prints actually are segments that could be endlessly developed and expanded. They're kind of cubes as an extract of an infinite kind of three-dimensional pattern. The rule was that, and they're based on data protection patterns enlarged, that from one side, one elevation, one section had to look like the original pattern. And once you turn around, they become something else. There were different ways of making them three-dimensional, by either extrusion, by confronting it with a different pattern, by taking the same pattern and having them run through each other. So this one here, for example, has the one that I showed earlier in the collection, a 7, a 0, 5, a 9. But then they were layered behind each other and started to fuse from one layer to the other and create this three-dimensional skeletal space. So these could be kind of used as a reading device for the work that I'm showing you now. It's not that they're patterns traced from one pattern to a real project, but it's the way we think about spatial construction and experience of being in kind of a skeletal space. One project is an exhibition design for Volkswagen. They have a science city, basically everything around cars and of course Volkswagen, and it's called Autostadt. One part of that exhibition there is on mobility and sustainability, and we started to think about what was the first moment when we thought sustainability and consumption is something that will change the way we survive in the future. This recycling triangle is maybe the first sign that I remember where we became conscious about recycling, about the cycle of production, consumption, and upscaling again. This is something that was maybe too simple, because nowadays we know it's much more complex. There are dead ends, there are complex interdependencies. It's more of a, let's say, network with dead ends, with multiple, let's say, reasons to connect in order to create a certain, impact on our environment. And this translated into a three-dimensional space embedded with a lot of information, interactive elements, projects that would actually highlight all these aspects in mobility, and sustainability became this level green space. That's the name of the project. It was constantly, since it was opened about 7 years ago, updated. The information is constantly updated, and even parts were replaced in order to keep it on the level of discussion that we have today. On a larger level, this skeletal space that you saw before was already explored in a dining hall near Karlsruhe, in Karlsruhe in the southern part of Germany. It's a building that used for the first time our timber construction process that we also used in the Metropol Parasol that Rudolf mentioned earlier, that has a polyurethane coating and therefore creates a certain that sculptural quality, because we could erase a lot of details that are usually let's say, expected when you do a building. There's no metal flashing, there's no other material. Once the rain hits it, the vertical, the floor, the ceiling, they all are, again, like kind of an envelope, in this case, more of a skeletal envelope that looks the same, but of course, every surface has a different property. So the polyurethane on the wall might be a different one than on the floor, because the pressure, the diffusion, let's say even the acoustic qualities have to be different. But in a way, it shows quite well what we try to achieve, which is a sculptural space that shifts back and forth between, let's say, it's difficult to grasp the scale of it because a lot of architectural elements like stairs or doors are more part of an overall sculptural gesture rather than a tectonic argument. So these are some images here. You see again the green on the floor, on the walls, on the ceiling. They all have different properties, but in a way it's the same skin or envelope of color that, that creates that space. On a larger level, again, a timber construction for the facade structure and the facade cladding is the Courthouse in Hasselt in Belgium. And this building was opened, I think, also around 5-6 years ago. It sits on a master plan by West8, and also West8 built this parking garage that you see here. It's like 3 levels with a steep park around here. And there's a whole development. Ours is the first one along that train track. A lot of projects happen, of course, on conversion areas here as well as in Europe. One famous one is Hudson, what's it called? Hudson Yards in New York. This one here is along the train tracks in the former cargo area in Hasselt, Belgium. You see the train station here. It has a master plan by Aldo Rossi for the whole ring of the beautiful old downtown of medieval downtown of Hasselt. And this here is the cargo area or former cargo area of Hasselt. Hasselt comes from hazelnut trees, which is kind of a beautiful icon and name for a city. But also the logo already shows that Hasselt means 2 hazelnut trees, and that's the beginning of a community. You have these 2 trees that already embrace each other. They kind of dance around each other. They start to communicate. And that was a beautiful, let's say, starting point to look at the city again. And what we found was that from each important period of the city, there were always 2 high points in the skyline. So the 2 medieval church towers and the 2 towers from the 60s, which was a technical town hall. And then West8 also proposed 2 towers on the new development. I'm not sure if they knew about this kind of 2 condition in the city, but it happens that they're also always in the same direction, placed in like north-south direction, placed on the city fabric. So one of them is actually our building, and the other one is the second tower to be built at some point by somebody else. There were 2 teams who won the competition. Our team was A2O Architects and Lenz Ass from Hasselt, and the other team was from Holland, Swansma, that won that other part. So the Courthouse has a couple of references, of course. It talks about the truss structures of the former cargo area. It talks about timber as maybe a reference to the hazelnut trees, but also it shows the division, the programmatic division of the building. We have that part, which are the courtrooms. This part is the University of Justice rooms and library, and this one here is for the lawyers and public cafe and roof terrace that you have up to overlook the city. And you see some images how the facade kind of plays with that pattern, that structure in different angles, even like little overhangs and glass and shading devices where it's necessary. We have this perforated skin that creates a depth to the facade. Partly is because of security issues and partly because of course, sun protection. The interior was done by Lenz Ass, so you even see that this tree metaphor also anchors inside where the reception desk is and into the furniture. And this one is an image of the roof, cafe, cafeteria, canteen, where you can overlook the city. And back to the parking garage roof and the little park by West8. We also made it onto a beer bottle, which you see here, along with all the other icons of Belgium. So that was a happy moment for us as well. Another conversion area, this is Dusseldorf, and not so far away from Hasselt, is this private university called FOM. It's basically an after-work school from 5 to 9. And during the day, they rent out the spaces to the university, which is very close, while if they need more space, they can rent spaces in the university in the evenings. It's a very successful model, kind of a secondary education program. And what you see here is a bridge that runs across a river, a street, and the train tracks. And the bridge is on a different level than this lower area, which was the former train cargo area. And our building kind of mediates between this upper level, kind of kisses that bridge and takes you down into the park, but the main access runs along this main park route. This is the entry here, and then you see these layers of different floors with cantilevers, and these cantilevers happen because they help us to reduce the overall volume, while we actually try to also reduce the interior circulation for more space for education. And all these cantilevers are basically waiting areas for in case of fire, or they help you to have connections with stairs to run down. And they, of course, are not calculated as the enclosed spaces for the overall square footage that was allowed on the site. So here you see again the cargo area. The former one we turned into a park and into a huge housing and office development, and at the end, the north end, is our building, and there is a possibility to do a small high-rise at the final end, which we did some studies on, but it wasn't pursued at this point. So in a way, if you look at the extension or the structure of extensions or the system of extensions of this building, we have the normal floor areas, and then we expand them where we need higher floors, so it's kind of stretched to the top, and then we have these extensions to the side in order to create resting areas or stairs, and we can, in the floor plans, reduce the elements of the stairs that we might need because we have meeting rooms and halls, so of course you need a lot of circulation and width of stairs. So by reducing them, we needed to actually push these areas outside, and that's how the shape or the facade of the building developed. On the lower level, you see the entrance and the larger halls, and then they continue to become smaller floors and smaller rooms all the way up to the top. So this one here is from underneath the bridge. You see the connection from the bridge down to the main entrance. And then from here, you have a larger three-dimensional, or like a big hall that takes you all the way up to the fourth floor. On the other side, you have stairs that take you down to escape in case of fire, also on the back side. Yeah, this is the back side where you have stairs that help you to run down. This is the main staircase inside. That is more of a communication space with resting areas, platforms where people can sit, stand. This is just before all the furniture came in. And here are some of the meeting rooms or teaching rooms, learning rooms on the inside of the building. And the view back to the city from the terrace all the way up on the roof, and some studies of the facade. I'm showing a couple of projects just to give you the range of work that we are involved with. This is the same, and then we continue more specifically with projects again. This one here is for the same university, a building that we are soon starting to construct in Berlin. That's also a very innovative material that we're using. It's ultralight concrete. So it's a concrete wall that's 2 feet deep. It doesn't have any insulation, no styrofoam or anything. It's fuel-free, fossil fuel-free, basically. And it has foams of, like pebbles of glass foam or adobe foam inside the concrete, and they create the insulation that we need. Of course, we have different regulations than you might have here in Miami. Mostly the problem is cold, but now slowly also we are facing heat as an exterior problem. So insulation is a big issue. And the windows are all double windows. So inside you have the thermo glass, and then on the outside there's a second layer that is only a one sheet, but it helps you to, there's a ventilation, so natural ventilation in between the two, so you can open the windows at night. On the inside it's protected against rain and entering the building, and also against wind, and therefore you can reduce the amount of technical and mechanical ventilation for cooling and heating the building. This is a high-rise for housing and doctor's offices in Dusseldorf. We are now starting with the facade. The concrete work is already done, so we hope to be finished by the end of the year, early next year. This is a timber project on the facade, but then inside is a very kind of efficient concrete grid for a software company in southern Germany. This one becomes a virtual reality hub and digital hub for the University of Potsdam, the Babelsberg Film Studios, and SAP software company, an old tram repair station from the 1900s that is kind of overspanned by a large 200-meter-long building to create very efficient contemporary spaces and more of a horizontal village inside here that creates different atmospheres and becomes really a new center for research and education. This is an office building in Berlin that we started construction just 2 weeks ago, just behind Alexanderplatz. It's only offices. It started as a shopping mall with a hotel and indoor skydiving and a surf rave, and all of that kind of transformed slowly into a different program while we constantly rethought the idea of how these boxes and this kind of architectural gesture might change and have to be redeveloped by completely changing the program. So instead of designing something that has a specific program, it was kind of retrofitting in the design process over the last 3 years, which was an interesting process as well. Basically similar to this one here, this is a train station, repair station, now turns into a research, a university building. And the retrofitting, of course, gives you opportunities to rethink, let's say, the program or the rooms that we usually are trained to design for specific programs. This one is an art space in Berlin for the George Grosz collection and George Grosz Museum, which is down here, an old gas station from the 50s, and the owner moves up here to allow a public program to enter or a public museum to enter on the ground floor. This one is a tram station in Freiburg, almost finished. It opens in about 2 weeks. This is a tram station we just finished 3 months ago in Kehl, which is somehow called the Tijuana of Germany or of Europe, because we have Strasbourg on one side of the River Rhine and Kiel on the other side. And there's a lot of going back and forth because the food is cheaper in Germany, but maybe the clothes, the fashion is more interesting in France. Hotels are cheaper in Germany. The European Parliament is in Strasbourg in France. So there was an interesting article to explain maybe similar relationships that we have. It was called the Tijuana of Europe. Now, let me jump to Georgia, which is maybe the largest project that we did, but it's mostly just acupunctural interventions in a country that was so much going through a transformation from something that was at the edge of Europe, now really becoming a booming country, a center of attention for tourism. Wine culture is back on everybody's attention who loves wine. And for club culture, supposedly they have now the best club in the world, better than even Berghain in Berlin. It's called Bassani. You can find it everywhere online. It's amazing. But we were contacted about 10 years ago by the former president of Georgia, Jacques Hasrili, and he was very impatient. He really wanted to push the country to something that is running, that is part of a production, that is part of a tourism culture, that is part of a cultural production. And we were one of maybe 5-6 architects, as I found out later, who really were helping him or helping the country to create attention for the value and the fantastic heritage that the country has to offer. So all these blue spots are potential buildings that we designed, and some of them were built. So Tiflis, which is the main capital, is here. There was no highway at that point. They started about a 1-hour highway till here. It took by car about 6.5 hours to get here. Now I think the highway is almost up to here. Here we built rest stops and gas stations. This is a train station that we built. There's a track width that changes from Turkey then to the former Russian Soviet Union countries. So it's an international train station in the middle of nowhere. This is Batumi, which is becoming kind of the Las Vegas of Georgia, a lot of hotels, gambling, alcohol, whatever you want when you're on vacation. Sabri is the border station to Turkey. It's a kind of Christian Orthodox country in the middle of a lot of, let's say, Muslim countries, Islamic countries. So there's a lot of freedom that you don't have in other countries around it, and therefore it also becomes quite interesting, important tourist destination for that part of the world, but also for cultural tourism and wine tourism, hiking. It really attracts a lot of Western people now from Western Europe to explore something that is really unique and special. So if you don't have plans for this year or next year, think about Georgia. I'm showing you a couple of projects that we did, and this is mostly infrastructure projects that we don't really get to build in Germany. When do you build a border station or a train station or a police station or a gas station? These are usually engineering projects. And I thought it was very impressive to see somebody thinking about these projects as architectural projects. Also because for many people, and now I'm jumping back quickly, for many people, Georgia is a transit country. It's, from Turkey to Azerbaijan, where all the oil is, or it's from Armenia, back to Turkey, or this part here is now interrupted because it's re-owned by Russia now. But it's a country that has a lot of, let's say, transit traffic. And the architecture that you might see on this traffic or on this transit is mostly the infrastructural projects. And to understand them as the image that you're leaving in people's mind or memory is what they saw on their way through the country is quite, I thought it was quite unique to understand this. So this is the train station in Achakalaki. This one, the rest stop in Gori. And again, these rest stops were built not only where there was already a highway, some of the rest stops were built where the highway will be at some point, because the rest stops not only introduced just gas, but also a supermarket, which at that point didn't really exist in Georgia. It was just the beginning of supermarkets and of, let's say, food supply as we know it. They also had cultural spaces where you could learn about the culture of the context or the neighboring villages or that specific local culture. And also they had some art and crafts markets that you see here on the outside and farmers markets. So it was also a gathering point and not just a service for trucks and cars driving through. For example, this one here, the one I showed you before, was on one side of the highway, and this one is on the other side with a beautiful view to the mountains. And when we went there for the opening of the rest stop, they had a beautiful, huge cake that looked like this rest stop building. And they were so happy because two couples already asked for having their wedding festivities after the church wedding in that rest stop. And then you understand how urgent something needs to happen, or how, let's say, how important it was to introduce something new, something that creates curiosity, that looks towards something else, towards the future. And to have a rest stop as your wedding festivity place, I think is quite an honor. Then we have a border station in Georgia and Turkey on the Black Sea coast, maybe the most beautiful site that we ever had to build a project. It's a building that welcomes visitors or says goodbye to people who went through Georgia. It's a building that actually looks at the border not as a line of division between two countries. It's a building that invites you to spend time there. It offers meeting rooms, it has conference spaces, there's a beach, there's of course shopping, there are terraces to overlook the city. So it's more of a conference hotel plus other programs. It's a very popular beach here. And then in Turkey, it's too steep, you can't really continue with the beach. But this building really becomes a destination rather than just a division line between two countries. So up here, on top of the checkpoints, you have meeting rooms that you can rent. There's a program here, there are terraces, and even rooms further up. This is a view from one of the meeting rooms to the Black Sea. And at night, this is how it greets you. and says goodbye. The smallest airport, and also mentioned as one of the most beautiful, maybe even the most beautiful airport in the world, not by me, but by some airport manuals and magazines, is this little building here in Mestia. It's one of the maybe one of the highest airports that exist. It's very difficult to get there because you have to fly very steep up and then through a kind of a saddle up here, and I did it maybe 3 times, and you're only about 100 feet above the ground, and if there's cloudy weather, you can't fly out. It has to be really perfect view, and then you fly down here and you land, and that's it. But it has this beautiful World Heritage villages here in Svanitsia, where you have these stone towers to protect your goods, but also to protect yourself if there's a tribe running through the valley again to rob you. You see these little towers back here, and then the tower for the airport. It's very simple. It's only 200 square meters. I don't know how that translates into square feet times 9. 2,500? No, yeah, about 10, yeah, almost, yeah. So it has basically 3 accesses. One is the tower, one is the check-in before security, and one is the finger after security, and that's it. And that's what you see here as an airport. There's a seating area, and again, the airport with Messia towers in the background. In the same town, we also built a town hall and a kind of a wedding chapel. That's how they light it up at night. We built a police station, and down on the Black Sea coast, we built kind of a sculpture that was meant to be let's say, the beginning of the construction of a whole new metropolis for 500,000 people. I think this was the last vision that Saakashvili started to build before he had to leave the country. But this one really was a pier with the sculpture where you can walk out, look back at the city, or look into the west towards the sunset. It's now sitting there quite lonely. Nothing really happened after that first construction. Some people sit there to fish. It was produced in Turkey in segments and then brought by ship to the beach, put together, and now it's quite lonely sitting there. Maybe one of the most lonely public spaces that I know, but it's really beautiful and kind of shows you, let's say, the dream that the country had about really pushing towards kind of a successful future. And I think after Saakashvili left, it had a little bit of a dip, but now there's a lot of energy coming back, and it's a fantastic country. Again, I'm not a tourist, a tourist manager, but I can really recommend traveling to Georgia at this moment of time. It's exciting to see the transformation. So, back to Germany, again, a public building that uses architecture to look at the relationship to history, but also create a certain iconic, image that is anchored in a specific condition that you find on site, and then translate into a 3-dimensional argument in order to celebrate a certain moment. In this case, it was the 300th University of Karlsruhe, and this was about 3 years ago. Karlsruhe is famous because it was one of these cities who were built on a very, let's say, strict, very geometric master plan. This is the castle, and then it had these radial streets running out with, they all focus on the tower of the castle, and then even the park and the forest behind had all these radial alleys, and that helped, when you went for hunting and these animals were kind of pushed through the forest, you would always see them where they were running because they had to cross at some point one of these alleys. But also Karlsruhe was a very important city in Germany because it had a very liberal agenda, different cultures, different religions, different nations, minorities who had to run away from other countries, all were able to settle here. And this is also still why we have the German highest court sits in Karlsruhe, just next to the castle here. So it has this tradition of being a very kind of democratic, very justful place in Germany. So, of course, something to be celebrated. And our proposal was this project here. We wanted to create a grid that was not monofocal, like the city fabric that only looks at the tower of the castle, which was all bombed in the Second World War and rebuilt. But we wanted to create a grid that had multiple focus points, more of a democratic grid rather than this very monarchic grid of the building before. And then the building somehow had to lean, if you take this as a spheric from a grid structure, had to lean on the side in order to allow a very important visual access from a lake that's down here to the main tower of the castle to be seen. It's all in timber because it was a temporary building only for a couple of months, and it had to be rearranged, recomposed, maybe built up on a different site or reused, and now some of the timber elements are used as seating benches in the city in different places. So on the outside, it created a stage. On the inside, there was a meeting room. You could even walk up. They had about 450 different concerts and programs in 300 days, so it was very intense. But also that park, it was kind of easy for us because that park sits in between two universities and is always kind of busy. People always hang out there. Karlsruhe is in the Rhine Valley. It's a very nice and comforting climate, very sunny, maybe one of the best climates we have in Germany. And for the ceremony, opening ceremony, when we didn't know they were planning this, these kind of rays of timber and light even extended all the way into the sky. So that grid of the city, that grid of our building, and the grid or this rays of light extended our project into the overall, let's say, cosmic reality. And even the fireworks kind of continued with that theme in a larger dimension. Another kind of building that plays with a very specific imagery or, let's say, placemaking is the garage in the design district. And we were invited a couple of years ago by Terry Riley, who was curating that facade of the parking garage. And it was a very interesting concept that we worked with. So it's Work AC here from New York. It's us from Berlin. Then it's Nicolas Buff, who is French but lives in Tokyo. There's Clavel Architectos from Miami, Murcia, and then Keenan Riley at the other end of the building. The concept that Terry introduced to us is based on the exquisite corpse. So one starts to draw the head, and then it's folded. You only see the last two moments of that line, and then you continue with the body, and somebody else draws the feet. So it's a kind of a collage of a facade, and that's also what the name of the building originally was. It was called the Collage Garage, and I still think it should be called that way. But later on, when two museums moved to that area, they renamed it Museum Garage to make it clearer as a destination for everybody to understand where they have to go to. But it's still, I think Collage Garage still works very well as a name, but also as the concept. And you see here the development, the unfolding of the facade, where here it's the turning, it's the curve, but you see how each are placed one after the other to create that, let's say, scale that works more on a pedestrian level rather than on the more industrial reality that happened there before. So I don't know how much you know about the design district. I'm just maybe condensing it very little. It's part, and it might be not correct because I'm only it's like secondary information that I have here. But Dakra and Craig Robbins bought a couple of blocks there, which was just warehouses basically, and developed it in 10, 12 years into now a destination for fashion, food, nightlife, art, culture, to museum, the De La Cruz collection, and the ICA moved there. It turned from, let's say, maybe of a kind of a leftover part of the city into a very dense pedestrian feel You have courtyards, the buildings are much smaller, the facades really create a certain, let's say, rhythm and attention span for pedestrians rather than for cars. And that's quite interesting to see how that worked. And as it's an experiment, and I think it works on many, many levels. And Museum Garage is one of those last projects on that development when, of course, people who drive there also need a place to put their car. So you see the development on the lower level, and usually we only had 3 elements, let's say 3 axes to place our facades, and we didn't really know where we were placed. We designed each part, then it got reshuffled, we had to reconnect. So it was a back and forth process that was quite unique and I think innovative in that way, how collaboration can work. And only in our intersection with Work AC, it was more like holding hands or like, connecting, reaching out to the other one, like 2 hands where the fingers interlock on the facade. After we designed our facade, which looked at the shape of car lights and other, let's say, organic shapes that we found on cars, once it was placed, we tried to reanalyze what it does to the overall facade development. And so we decided basically to connect this to the Work AC facade and to the last one to kind of hold both ends together on our project. So there's an inversion of the holds and closed areas of Work AC to, let's say, now of the floating elements. And there is, let's say, a placement of these security stripes that you have on Keenan Riley's facade onto our project. And so by taking 2 elements and fusing them in ours, we wanted to create a mediation between the 2. And the project is called Hugs and Kisses. In a way, it talks about embracing and loving each other. You have studies in the beginning that were these opening elements. There are 40 to 60% of air ventilation that we had to allow. And then this one then was placed next to the neighbors, and we started to create these overlaps or these references to other facades. And I'm showing a couple of projects, now, a couple of images now during the construction process. It's a very simple, like generic concrete grid behind that facade, and we only had about 3 feet here. Work AC had a little more because there was a different distance between the structural grid and the facade. So they were able to introduce some program like stairs and a library and a playground and a little ramp. But here we only had basically light air and a little bit of a relief that we could introduce to our facade. And this is now what you see when you get there at night. There's also a panel here that is changing, maybe rotating every 2 years with a different artist artwork that's placed here. And I'm just moving you around the building a little bit. So this is our project here with perforated elements that glow at night. You see this kind of trying to work your way around the corner. It's kind of you see the work of the curve that happens there. And then there are these cuts to the other projects. This is Nicolas Buff. He fuses kind of Baroque drawing with manga, Japanese manga. You have elephants with, who transport obelisks and other elements, maybe Ghost Ride references. So it has a lot to do with mobility and transportation. Then you have Clavel Architects, who took car bodies and they had to be redone because of fire issues and construction issues. And the headlights and glow at night, and then the Keenan Riley security barriers. And I think this one should be a video. I don't know if that's working. No. Still in the States. I do what? Again? Click on what? On the extra mouse. That's somewhere here. Yeah. I know. Okay. I think it looked better without the trees in front of our facade. Now you hardly see the facade anymore. Okay. And how do I jump back? How do I go back to this slideshow? Further down here. Further up. Further up. Here. This is the next one. Okay. Okay, another public project that deals with the history of a specific site and its kind of a unique geometry is XXX, Times Square with Love, that we installed about 2 years ago. It was commissioned by the Times Square Arts Alliance, who are running the program on Times Square, which is silent operas, sports events, theater, public interventions, the Valentine's Heart, and so forth. We proposed XXX, Times Square with Love, as a project where it allows you to look at the Times Square in a different angle. One is like laying down, looking up, which is the most simple one, but also in a way to look at it via your social media and digital devices, and you communicate being on that space also beyond the pure limits of the square. So we wanted to deal with all the webcams that you have already on Times Square as something that looks down on you while you're looking down and looking up. So this relationship between what is already there embedded as media and which other space in the world, has that much media presence than the Times Square, and to make you kind of conscious but also playful with that reality. So Times Square is an X that comes from 7th Avenue and Broadway. That's one starting point. The other one is, and it's placed then next to the reclusion pavilion, so no safer place than here where you can sleep and have a nap during the day. There's always 2-3 guys with machine guns around you to protect you. But also it refers to a history of Times Square which was a little more seedy, and Times Square Arts Alliance really responded very quickly to that and saying, well, finally, we can refer to this because we get often criticized that it became so sanitized and such a commercial space. It's just shopping anymore. Like, we completely forgot about, the history of Times Square and 42nd Street. And I remember when I was just starting to study in '92 in Princeton, and we went to New York, they just all closed these movie theaters. All these art projects like Barbara Krug or Delos Cofidio did their arts interventions on the awnings, on the facades, these videos on the doors. So in a way, I had this in mind, or I remembered this was kind of a really strange and important change that happened in that part of the city. So XXX, Best Porn in Town, is basically also a reference to that part of New York, which was once a very lively part of New York. But also it asks you that there's a certain interaction that people have with each other just by its geometry that's introduced. So it offers space for at least 4 people, even more. You have to negotiate who can stretch their legs, who has to move around a little bit. You might sit down next to you, next to each other. Of course, social media and your iPhone is very important to communicate you were there, like you are there. You can prove that you were there. And it allows you to sit down and rest. Now they even have signs up saying, please be kind to other people, no longer sitting or lying than 20 minutes, and no sleeping. But this is the reality. There's at least, 20 webcams that you can log on online. And on one, you can see the XXX. We wanted to actually work with this dialogue where the webcams record you. You could log onto that webcam and actually see yourself lying there and sending it out to your friends, or looking at the webcam means looking down on you and so forth. We couldn't really realize that media part of it, but the consciousness was there, and this was the concept that we had, that you're traced. You look up, they look down on you, and the whole world basically could look down on you at that time. Of course, we want to share this, and this is what we all do now. We prove, we take selfies. We created a Snapchat filter with the Times Square Arts Alliance, which looked similar to this one here. And people used it. There were even like signs how to log on and how to communicate that. These were some mock-ups that we did. We all know these realities by now. After the opening, and I think 3 seconds after the ropes were taken away, it was, since then, I think there's 24 hours, somebody sitting on them. And at night, it's more busy than during the day. But even the evening after it opened, I took a cab home to Brooklyn. It was on the cab video. And if Times Square doesn't have that media presence, who else would have it? So this was fun to look at. 2 weeks later, on the real estate page, it was all about that area in Manhattan. And the image to kind of tell you there is a change happening was the triple axis on Times Square. Very minor, like tiny intervention, creating such a different, let's say, perception of that space. And I thought that was an interesting point, how scale really scales in a completely different way. And then a little bit later, about an hour, a year later, it also was part of the 10 places that define New York City reimagined. And the final project I wanted to show you, not as busy as Times Square and not as empty as the La Sica Pier project in Georgia, but creating a real new prototype for a public space is Metropol Parasol in Seville. This competition we won in 2004, so this is almost already 15 years ago, 14, 15 years ago. And it changed the city in a dramatic way. The city itself changed, not only because of our intervention, but again, a very, let's say, dramatic update of, let's say, public space, of, let's say, urban culture, of, let's say, a generation that is eager to create and be part of a dynamic that is quite amazing. So here you have the Plaza de la Encarnación, which is the site for the CETAS, Metropol Parasol. And these are all the, say, larger public areas, the gardens of the castle here. No, sorry. This is the Giralda, the cathedral, Bullfight Ring, town hall, a large park which is called, now I'm missing the word. What's the name of it? Alameda, exactly. So this is the largest medieval downtown of Europe, as we were told, and everything that's on the other side of the river is the expo site from '92. And this is when I was in Seville for the first time. And I remembered it was really hot. It was very unbearable to be outside. And when the competition asked for introducing a new urban space for the 21st century, the first thing I imagined was shade and shadow, because that's the first thing that you need to actually hang out on the outside. What you also see is that it's a very dense fabric. It's basically like Venice without the water, and you have very, very rare but very important open areas, little pockets of parks or plazas. This one here was never really a plaza. It was a cloister, then the cloister became bigger, they ripped out more fabric, then it became a market, a food market. I showed you a picture of that earlier. So we thought to reimagine this space and to keep in the tradition, it was always a building, an institution, and not so much an open public space. This is Metropol Parasol, the largest timber structure in the world, as our engineers told us, and a timber construction company. It has a couple of different layers, but one important one is to go up there and overlook the city. It sits in the very heart of this medieval downtown, and it has also the main historic axis running through it. When the excavation started to actually build a parking garage, underground parking garage, about now maybe 20 years ago, a little longer than that, they found all these old fish markets, mosaics, ruins of the building of the city, basically the founding of the Roman city of Sevilla. And this is what we found at the beginning of the competition, this was the reality where when the city started to construct this parking garage, take out the ground, they realized it's a window to the history of the city that you cannot just erase by a parking garage. So it sat there for a couple of years, maybe 10 years or so, until the idea for this competition started. And it was an open competition that we entered as, I think, many other architects. 2 stages. The first one was completely anonymous, then they selected completely different 10 proposals. One was a big jungle, one was a project like Centre Pompidou, one was a minimalist plaza with 3 high-rises, one was our project, one was kind of a fun palace project in the middle of the city, one was more, let's say, historic buildings, reconstructions of the old city, and so forth. And then all these 10 projects had to come to Seville, talk to each other, present to each other, present to the public. And then there was everything available online, each drawing, each text. There was a guest book at that point. Now you would call it a blog. People would write on it. They would exchange ideas. And we were the one, or our project was the one who was the most enthusiastically discussed. And that gave us a real strong push. We worked hard, and then we won the competition in 2004. This was the site for the market, or this was the market on that site, which was demolished in the 1970s. It was really run down. I think today everybody would try to save it, but in the 70s it was more important to create a temporary car park in the center of the city. Then when the competition started, we did a couple of tests, like what would this roof look like that then embeds everything else underneath, like the food market, the archaeological museum, the window into the history of the city. And these studies then turned into the proposal that we sent in as more of a cloud structure, more conceptual cloud in the beginning, in the first phase, and then we actually had to ground it in the second phase that came until June 2004. There were a couple of references that helped us to argue this project as something that is really specific for that place and not just a drop sculpture, that could land anywhere. One was these huge trees on the neighboring plaza, this beautiful undulated stone roof, the cathedral, again, a floating kind of carpet above the city, and of course, the structure of the cathedral inside that becomes the space-defining element. This is the layering of the program. You have archaeological site, all the mosaics and Roman ruins. Then this is the food market that we had to bring back. An elevated plaza as a roof to the food market now for specific events. And then the roof with another cafe and a big room to rent, like for festivities, and the skywalk to overlook the city. The design worked the other way around. We started with the roof. Then we had to place the loads on very specific points where we were allowed to actually go into the archaeology that was pre-researched by the archaeologists before. So we had to kind of collect these forces on very specific points. And then the other program kind of built up from the bottom. Everything you see in light beige is timber construction. The rest in brown or in gray is either steel or concrete. And we had to build some parts in steel because of the spans, mostly across the archaeological sites. And then for the elevator shafts, we needed concrete cores because of earthquake and fire issues, but everything else then became a timber construction. And it's not that we wanted it to be timber from the very beginning, but by researching different parameters with the engineers, with the construction companies, and then with another company at the end, we compared steel construction, timber with polyurethane coating, glass fiber reinforced concrete, and it was always the timber with the polyurethane coating who kind of was supposed to be the best solution when you look at prefabrication qualities, construction pollution, earthquake behavior, fire behavior, cost development, logistics, and so forth. And therefore, it became a timber project. It looks much simpler as it is here, but in the end, just the connecting forces from one element to the other was so complicated, and we couldn't even follow anymore. They talked about micro components of 0.07 something that would actually try and change the whole way how these forces translate from one element to the other. So that was actually the most critical part. Then the timber comes from Finland. It was brought to Germany. It was layered, laminated in Germany, then brought to Seville, coated with polyurethane outside of Seville, then brought on the construction site. About 4,000 different joints here that had to be, of course, very well cataloged. You see the two concrete towers here for the elevators. The steel construction that runs above the archaeology. The putting together of the timber, step by step, overlooking the city. And so the roof is created with these open ends. And in a way, if you look at the design from the first phase, which was a perforated kind of cloud skin, to now building the volume inside that skin and leaving the skin basically immaterial, allowed us to be quite flexible when it came to adjusting to requirements from the landmark department, be lower here, go higher here, from the engineers, less weight here, more like span height on this side. So just by going up and down, these kind of inside grid was very helpful to adjust to all these different requirements. And here you see all the connecting parts. There are steel joints with, let's say, metal rods that run 50 centimeters to 1 meter, like 3 feet into the timber to hold these elements together. From above, you see the grid that's kind of transparent and open. Only in the parts where you have meeting rooms and cafe, it's a roof that's covered. And then by finally arriving at the site, you have this dialogue with the historic city fabric around it, the sky that creates the shadow. This was the first idea that we had in mind, the shadow that really defines the space and that changes over the period of a day, even the seasons. And one moment it's like a grid, and then a little later it becomes a swoop. It hits the shadow against one of these columns. It projects it down onto a seating area of a cafe, or it projects this grid, kind of this orthogonal, very rational grid that then loosens up and becomes organic above it onto the elevated plaza. Some dialogue again with the neighboring buildings, and when you're all the way up there, you have the walkway overlooking the city at night. It's open till I think 1 o'clock or at least midnight, where civilians are allowed to go up there for free. For tourists, it's $1.50, and you get a drink for it on the top. So it's very, let's say, inviting and friendly to be there. But now I'm showing you how it really arrived in the city. It becomes part of the advertising, the city advertisement. People who were involved in the church, in the Semana Santa, which is this religious week before Easter with all the floats, they really hated the project. They were fighting against it. They had demonstrations. They thought it was ruining everything that Seville, achieved in the last 500 years. But the year after it was finished, it was even put on their cover, so it couldn't be so bad even for Semana Santa. And it wasn't so bad for Semana Santa. It also was very good for the Christmas markets. Schools built it as a crib, with it became a kind of pedagogical tool. But this is the Semana Santa where you have all these floats going through the city. These big stairs are very, inviting to look at the floats coming by. There are about 20 men underneath these very heavy structures. You can hear the breath. There's a very specific music. They go very slowly through the city, and you see here, this is the float. This is how a week before Easter looks like, and especially under Metropol Parasol. You have flamenco festivals. You also have political parties, and this was in 2012 when the Podemos and I think this was 2011 when the new party, the Indignados and the Podemos development started to discuss about an alternative future of the city. Also, it spread all over the country, of course, and in Sevilla it was happening underneath Metropol Parasol. This is when people discuss about the future of their city, of their culture, of their future. This is when the party was founded in Seville They even use it as their logo, so it was a sign for a different future of the city or of the country. At that time, it was also allowed to sit there, to have discussion groups. Even in this case, let's say the structure of the project with these 6 stems was organizing these demonstrations of this very important political movement. So one stem was the Wi-Fi zone, one stem was the kitchen, one stem was like the sign up for the discussion groups and so forth. So even there was a plan, and I can't find it anymore. I took a picture where it says exactly which stem or which kind of footprint was doing what during that moment. And you were even allowed to sleep there, which is not possible anymore now. This is kind of a regular day when it's busy and warm and beautiful in Seville, but it works also for different media. For example, for very cheesy Latino pop. I found this online on YouTube. It also works for hip hop. It works for another cheesy Latino pop, that's the elevator shaft or upstairs on the Parasol. It works for Bollywood music, and it works for Swiss chansons. It didn't actually work for Miss Spain, who wanted to become Miss Universe. She took pictures up there. She did not get Miss Universe. This was last week. Spring Harvest Bazaar shot the new beige soft neutrals, they call it, on Metropol Parasol. So this is the spring color of 2019. New Balance found it inspiring for their soles. This was a couple of years ago for the public viewing of the soccer games. Advertising also likes it, especially car companies. This one was rebuilt by Mercedes-Benz. The floors are different, and we don't have these kind of buildings in the back. But BMW was there. Also Jeep was there. Volkswagen actually replaced it onto some like highway with some other background, I don't know. That was expensive for them. This was Renault who was there. And it also works for selfies and people who want to prove that they were at the right spot on their vacation. It works for social media and for dating apps. Tinder on the left, Grindr on the right. It always makes you look smart better. And it was on the cover of Seville, of the Lonely Planet Seville, even with the #1 travel destination in 2018. Of course, we know it's never really good and bad. This also causes a lot of problems with Airbnb culture, tourism kind of killing some of the, let's say, neighborhood realities that we enjoy usually. So it's something that is also, of course, critically to be observed. But Red Bull also likes, of course, the shapes and skaters of the floor becomes a vertical element. This is Gay Pride or the Cartoon Festival on the other side. So that turns into fashion at some point. There's, of course, tourism and souvenirs, little elements that you want to take with you. Calendars that you can buy on the street photography, street art. And then there are offsprings too. This one I got sent from an Indian friend. This is an Indian sports television show, and they liked it. And I'm not saying that maybe they come directly. There's something in the air, or it was something in the air at that time, where this kind of gridded intersection of sheets are just out there, and they appear in all kinds of scales here as airport lounges, as interiors of shops, as competition entries for other projects. And I get this sent by friends and colleagues as even furnitures, and in a very minor detail, and I hope now that video is running. And this is a video I brought for Rudy. It's for everybody who loves cats, and I always wanted to end my lectures with a cat video. So I got approached. They did research on what's the best motif for Cat's Best. And the test clientele always came back with Metropol Parasol on the packaging as the most suiting motif. And here's the video.
Die Natur hat einen schlauen Weg erfunden, Feuchtigkeit aufzunehmen. Nach diesem Prinzip haben wir Cat's Best entwickelt. Die pflanzliche Katzenstreu aus technologisch veredelten Aktivholzfasern, die Feuchtigkeit und Gerüche aufnehmen und einschließen. Und so auf vollkommen natürliche Weise bis zum 7-fachen ihres Volumens binden. Kompakt, ganz leicht zu entfernen und so hygienisch, dass die Streu bis zu 7 Wochen im Katzenklo bleiben kann, bevor der nächste Komplettwechsel fällig ist. Eine rundum saubere Sache. Cat's Best. The power of nature.
Now I can move back to my slideshow, but there's actually just patterns at the end. This is how I wanted to finish the lecture. You have to find an obsession. You have to find an obsession. You have to go through it in different scales, in different applications, in different moments of interventions into a city fabric. But it all comes back to where you started, to an idea how a surface can envelope you, can become three-dimensional, talks about public and private, talks about innovation in administration and in communication. And that's it for today. Thank you so much. Did you like the cat video?
We usually have a more formal kind of interview to just lead the conversation and open it to the public. But I think because we are behind schedule, so I think we're gonna skip that. Is that okay, Charlotte? And then maybe you can lead with a question, and then we open it immediately to everybody, because I think also I know they're anxious to ask you questions also. So do you want to?
There's another microphone here also.
Hi. Hello. I had just a little question. It seems with your interest in surface and sculpture somehow, I mean, there seems to have been some, after the economic crisis of 2008, sort of an end declared of the iconic building, but you seem to be quite resistant to that. Maybe you can share your thoughts on that.
I think this sounds a little bit like the generic discourse or the generic argument. And the beauty of architecture is that there is so much to do. And it opens up into different categories. And there is architecture that, is more sculptural. There's architecture that is maybe more socially involved. There's architecture that tries to blend in. There's architecture that doesn't want to be seen. There's architecture who actually needs to activate certain areas. I see our work, as an architectural intervention that's activating, that actually looks at areas usually that need certain attention. At the same time, they involve a political statement, of course, and you see that maybe most directly with the Seville project. And I remember we got critiqued a lot. This was the end of, oh my God, architecture just stands in for itself. It's not for the people. And all this kind of talk that we remember of about 10 years ago. And I think the reality should prove completely the opposite, that actually it needs a certain attraction, it needs a certain curiosity that you create, it needs a certain, let's say, newness and also adventure and risk to find an architecture that talks, that uses the technologies that we have today, that actually talks about the possibilities that we have today to look into what are the new construction methods and also show what they do. And that also involves looking at the input and the contributions to a social sustainability, a cultural sustainability, and also an economical sustainability. We also do housing projects, for, let's say, affordable rent, and we are just now doing under construction a housing project in Berlin for 240 units. They also have a sculptural quality to it, and I don't think that actually caring for somebody doesn't mean that you have to be quiet about what you want to do with architecture. So I think just one extreme jumped into the other one, and we like to embrace both of them.
Other questions? Well, I have one while students are formulating theirs. Thank you for a beautiful, very thoughtful lecture. One thing that always intrigues me about the work is how it really tackles humor. it's a very difficult tone in architecture. You know, humor makes sporadic appearances. It's very rare. I mean, in my mind, the last time we saw it actually deployed successfully perhaps was with Venturi. And I think in your work, clearly, there is an attempt at humor. Can you elaborate a bit about that?
Oh, I don't know if I'm prepared for answering this, but I remember I talked to a couple of friends from my generation that we look at these younger architects and wonder what's going on. Like there's a certain simplicity. You gave me that beautiful book, you know, that you produced in the school a couple of years ago. Issues, you know, of geometry, maybe a certain retreat from the complexity that's out there, trying to find maybe another 0.0, you know, to rethink about typology in architecture and so forth. When we were in school, and I talked with Juergen a lot about this too, because you start to question, you know, what are the different urgencies and needs and desires in every generation. When we were in school, we were always pushed to like push the limits of the discipline, make it more complicated, you know, look at the boundaries. We kind of had to make the profession more complex, while at this point it feels more like, and maybe the world was safer around us, so we had this kind of playfulness or this kind of, this freedom to kind of over-complexify our profession. Well, nowadays it seems there's a feeling of uncertainty and I'd say uncontrollability of what's out there, that younger architects feel like they have to completely retreat and try to find the foundations again of our profession. So it's a different way of looking at these kind of in my, let's say, in my education, into the stretches of how architecture can also talk about other things, how architecture also is a serious business, but also can laugh at itself, can play with it. I see our buildings not as solutions, I see them as placeholders or as questions to a certain context. I don't feel they need to like be the only solution for a specific site. They're one proposal of many, and they should start a discussion. They should actually also take the load away from that architecture can solve everything. It can't. It just can be a contribution to a larger, let's say, built reality that we all can do as best as we can, specifically with, you know, issues of sustainability. When I showed the Volkswagen project, we don't really know what's right and wrong anymore. But what we feel is correct today might be completely like wrong tomorrow. There's, you know, discoveries every day, and all we can do is perform to our own consciousness that we feel like this is what at this point I feel is right to do. And there's a certain lightness and of course a certain, let's say, trial and error attitude that is as important as, of course, you know, caring about what you do and being conscious that you're, you know, working with the money of other people. It's not risking success, but it's actually taking curiosity as a foundation for the projects. Does that help? Is that kind of, I'm kind of brainstorming while you're asking.
I mean, clearly some of the projects like the new bus stop, like it has that kind of Flintstones quality. There are instances where clearly you are being very playful and a bit irreverent, let's put it this way. But there are other moments of humor that are almost subversive, like the projects for Georgia, like the police station and the border crossing. They bring like levity to instances where one would expect a lot of, you know, solemnity and, you know, state pomposity, but actually they are tongue-in-cheek, they are playful, they are irreverent. So I see in this like a critical project in a way. So am I reading too much into it, or?
Well, you always need to, you know, I'm working with the money of other people, so if they don't get that as well, you know, if they don't have that kind of playfulness in them as well, that curiosity, or looking at architecture as an adventure, as a kind of a test also how to kind of tickle or tackle the public, then, you know, it's not working. So it's an accomplice, how do you call it? You need an accomplice, which is your client, and then, of course, the people who use the buildings and live in them. And Which project? The sculpture. The Sevilla project? The timber project in Sevilla? Yeah, we have sprinklers. We work with Arab as engineers, so it was a very complicated project. And what you see in the project of, when the timber comes down, there's actually concrete and steel that has to go up all the way to 18 feet. In case there's a car that burns, it doesn't, the flames wouldn't actually touch the timber. The timber in the polyurethane doesn't burn by itself, but it burns if there's fire next to it. So that is one fire protecting element. Then in parts where there is a fire escape on the ground floor, like an escape door, these parts had to be sprinklered on the outside. So in case of fire, that part wouldn't actually drop down as a burning, hot polyurethane drop that comes down. I mean, every building that we build has to perform to the economic, framework. We have to be smart of where we push the money, in a building to make the most out of it. And of course, all the technical requirements need to be fulfilled, of course. But we try to get around sprinkler. Usually we don't need sprinklers in our buildings, only in some very selected parts.
What did it cost?
I have no idea. It really, like what, one sprinkler or like 1 square meter of sprinkler? The project was 110 million euros, but 30 million were just the archaeology. It's 150 meters long, 70 meters wide, and about 33 meters high. I can't, is anybody else
Okay.
raising their hand? No.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.